This is an amazing stage to join. You get to pick up a lot of different skills from support and careers in general. There's this relationship between how much you earn and how much you learn.
I often talk to engineers who work at startups and they talk about how, oh, I wear multiple hats. So that means that I also need to play the product manager role. But how does that work when you have an engineer and a product manager at a startup?
Things change a little bit after pre-seed and some seed funding. And so being able to demonstrate quick wins along this way towards some sort of big goal is how you can establish leverage.
Hey everyone, today I have Sarthik again on my channel. Sarthik has talked a lot about his extensive product management experience in our last video together, and he also has a lot of startup working experience in general. So I really wanted to make another video with him where he shares more about his startup experiences.
For sure, yeah. I've had experiences all the way from trying to start something of my own to working at companies of different sizes that are smaller companies. So happy to get into this and answer any questions that you have.
Definitely. I wanted to kick it off first with, can you just talk more about what it's like to work at a startup? Because the answer to the question can vary a lot depending on the funding stage, the culture, maybe the type of product that the startup is aiming to launch.
Yeah. So I think in careers in general, there's this relationship between how much you earn and how much you learn. And I actually think it's kind of inversely correlated. Typically with startups, you're really optimizing for learning and wearing a lot of different hats. And the degree to which you can specialize, especially if you want to go into particular careers, depends on if you're working at a large tech company versus if you're working at a startup. And again, depending on where you are and what you're interested in, there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all type thing. I'll give you a few examples. So with startups, typically, you have stages all the way from founders working in an apartment or a garage, all the way to a public company. And they have different types of funding rounds to get to a public company, which is the goal of many startups. So typically, stages that you might care about are things from pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, onwards towards a public company. With pre-seed companies, you're typically working with the founders themselves.
Yes.
And you might have maybe up to 5 to 10 employees at that stage. Your goal at that point is really getting to product market fit. If you're very interested in understanding what it takes to go from an idea to something that makes money and makes users' lives amazing, this is an amazing stage to join. You get to pick up a lot of different skills from support to sales to engineering and everything else in between. And you get to interact with the founders and see how they think. You're pretty closely involved with talking to customers, talking to investors, and a lot of good learning happens in getting to a point where you start making money, which again is the goal of many pre-seed and seed stage companies. Things change a little bit after pre-seed and some seed funding, where you might start to have more specialization. And typically you start seeing a lot of teams around engineering, around sales, around design start to form. What's neat about this sort of stage is you get to own an entire area by yourself. If you're a killer designer and you'd like to have ownership of defining an entire organization's culture around that, this is an amazing sort of stage to join. And so between seed and Series A is where you get to own different teams and really set the direction for how a company thinks about this. Starting Series A, that's typically when a startup has accrued a series of customers that really love it and has enough momentum to want to grow. And so this is where you start to experience a lot of interesting challenges and opportunities with scaling. So this is where if you join early at a startup, you typically start managing your first team members. You also have opportunities to specialize more. And there's a lot of roles that open up at this stage, especially if you work in enterprise companies around customer success, around solutions engineering, which aren't that common in early stages. Typically at that stage, the founders do a lot of these roles themselves. And this is also where you start running into really interesting technical challenges around scalability, around infrastructure needs, where you're catering to internal teams and not customers directly. And yeah, it just goes on and on from there.
That's amazing. That is a lot of details that I didn't know about. So earlier you talked a lot about scaling as you get more funding and you go further in the series stage of a startup. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how the work changes as the startup gets bigger.
Yeah, I'd say there's changes in the scope of work that you typically have. There's changes in the stakeholders that you interact with, both internal and with customers, to make the product successful and the company successful. And there's also an opportunity to either get good at your craft in individual contributor roles or manage larger teams. I'd say those are the rough axes along which the work changes. With early stages of startups, again, product market fit, typically seed and pre-seed stages, that's really the only thing that matters. And so being able to work with customers directly, get a strong signal of what the market wants, and being able to build the product either directly yourself or with your engineering teams, that's really the thing that you get really sort of good at. And nothing else almost matters if the startup doesn't survive beyond that. After that, all possibilities really open up, depending on the nature of the business. So some sorts of companies are more operationally intensive. So think of all your food delivery startups, or think of e-commerce or these sorts of domains, right? And so you have an an opportunity to really step into any of these areas that the company really wants you to step into. One of the flip sides to this is you don't have as much choice in the type of work that you choose to pick up at this stage. So it's really the thing aligned with what the company's mission is and the types of customers that they're going after. But over time, as the company grows more specialized, as you start adding more people, it becomes important to, one, align new people that don't understand how the company has faced similar challenges in the past, and also establish some sort of bar, either quality or culture or ways of approaching problems. And so you start adopting the beacon of culture and how you think about approaching problems. The final sort of aspect of this is specialization. Again, ironically, for many sort of interesting roles that the audience here might be interested in, these might not be available at the earliest stages because, again, you're so focused on product market fit. If you want to, for example, get really good at selling to Fortune 500 companies that are in the healthcare domain, that might not be something that a startup that's just struggling to get the product market fit necessarily has. Again, having worked at a startup like this, that is sort of the luxury that you have at later stages. And you can take up roles in solutions engineering or sales or customer success. Really get that expertise within this domain. So I'd say that's an example of how the work changes as the startup grows up.
Another follow-up question around work that I actually had was, I often hear this concept of if you work at a startup, you will quote unquote wear multiple hats.
Yes.
But I was really curious how that differs when you're an engineer or a product manager, because I often talk to engineers who work at startups and they talk about how, oh, I wear multiple hats, so that means that I also need to play the product manager role. But how does that work when you have an engineer and a product manager at a startup? Where does that?
Yes, what's the boundary? Again, a lot of things from a product management lens are about understanding what the user's needs are and being able to illustrate that with your engineering team and your design team. So typically an engineer might get involved in early demos or early sort of customer facing commits as far as the technical details of a product are concerned. Especially in enterprise software, if you're an early product hire, you're typically working with the customers themselves directly, understanding what sort of relationship there is, what their needs are, and designing the platform around those sorts of needs. And your engineers over time should ideally get out of these customer conversations and into actually building a platform that's scalable. So a product manager's leverage at the earliest stages really becomes extracting the signal and helping focus the engineer, design, and the founders towards the core metric that really matters to make the product successful.
Right.
And it's that sort of distillation and focus that really is huge leverage for you as a PM.
So I often hear this concept that product managers are usually the last cross-functional role that gets hired into a startup, because usually startups focus on building the product, so it's usually just a lot of engineers from the very beginning, and then they just do a lot of the product management work. And so I was curious to hear more about your thoughts around this.
Yeah, that's definitely true to a certain extent, to a certain scale. So most of the times the founders themselves end up playing a lot of hats in terms of determining what the direction of the product should be and what the customer needs. Product management as a function is typically you see around Series A. That's typically when the founders have enough things going on that they'd like to hire someone to oversee the product direction and make sure that the right things are getting built that'll give the company some sort of long-term enduring value over time. So a product manager's leverage when they're hired in such an early stage is really mind reading to a certain extent. It's understanding what the founder thinks about the company, the platform, what their needs are, what are gaps that need to be addressed immediately, and almost being able to echo that to a certain extent. Doing this in an effective way where you can almost become like a second brain of the founder that owns a lot of these product responsibilities ends up being the way that you get leverage, because it earns the trust that you're approaching problems the right way. It helps them feel like they don't have to babysit every single decision that's being made, every conversation that they need to have, and it helps you establish some sort of direction. The other thing here, I'm a big believer in having a strong first 100 days. And typically the way that product managers are hired in many companies is there's a lot to ship, but you don't really know what to ship, or you know there's some sort of gap or some sort of huge deadline that's coming, but you need someone to sort of oversee this process, delivery of the product. And so being able to demonstrate quick wins along this way towards some sort of big goal is how you can establish leverage. Another tactic that can help product managers is being able to, again, understand the needs of internal stakeholders as well as customers and establish these milestones that will help you get your feet wet. It doesn't have to be the most important thing, but again, that is really what helps you to get established within a company, earn trust of the team, and for them to start respecting your decisions.
Be sure to watch the next video with Sarthik. We will be discussing should I work at a startup or big tech. Thank you all so much for watching.
Guys, isn't this amazing content? You really should like, comment, subscribe, and engage with Melody's content. This channel is going places, and I'm so excited personally to see where this channel goes.
Thank you so much for being a part of this channel journey. All right, see you all next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.